Bonjour. Good afternoon. Welcome to everybody. Our theme today is employment and productivity in an era of transition. So what transitions? We will talk about this. Are they ecological, environmental, societal, social? And we have a panel of top-notch speakers that I will be presenting in a few moments. I'm very happy to be with you to moderate this session. I am Isabelle GOUNIN-LEVY. I work for LCI, the news channel. With me, we have Augustin, who's a professor in finance in HSE, working for the IMF. You're a member of the Economic Analysis Council, and your research is in finance and companies, and you're a member of the Cercle of the Economists. With us, we have remotely Filippo di MAURO. You are an expert in economics. You've worked a lot on productivity, international competitivity of countries and companies. You have more than 30 years of experience in international organizations and central banks. You've worked for the Asian Development Banks, the Bank of Italy, the ECB, the American Federal Reserve. You are founder of COMNET, which is a network of research on productivity in Europe, which seeks to understand how the productivity of companies is changing in a digital era. So you are at the heart of our subject. Benoit GRISONI next to me. You started with Paris Asset Management, then you joined Fimatech's Boursorama in 1998. In 2003, you were appointed director of Boursorama Invest, and you're the first executive in Boursorama, and you become deputy director and general director of Boursorama in November 2007. Opposite me is Karim TADJEDDINE. You're an associate and senior director at McKinsey. You are in charge of the public sector activity. You're coordinating the economic revival plans, and you do research on development and economic inclusion. In particular, one of the authors on the note of after the climate crisis, prepared exclusively for the Rencontre, which you can access on the Rencontre website. And you're also administrator of the Generation Foundation, which includes 13 countries and 30,000 children. Remotely also, we have Geoff TILY from the Trade Union Congress. For 25 years, you were a member of the State Services, and you also worked on the production and interpretation of macroeconomic statistics. Jean-Jacques BARBERIS, you began your career at the General Direction of the Treasury, and you work on climate and finances. In 2012, you joined the cabinet of the Ministry of Finance and Economy to talk about the challenges of corporate funding, and you also participated in the creation of the French Public Investment Bank, and you also worked with the president, where you were an economic advisor until 2013, and then you became responsible for the sovereign and institutional clients and vice president of finances for tomorrow. Thierry, PECH, you are a former pupil of the ENS school, and you were General Secretary of the think tank of the Republic of Ideas. You directed the publishing house of Le Say, and you're also a consultant for the SOCD. You work with the magazine Esprit Public, and you're co-president of the Citizen Convention for Climate. So you know all you need to know about the speakers today. Thank you for being with us. And to set the scene, I'm going to ask Augustin to begin, because you are the coordinator of this session. So you will be explaining to us how this productivity and employment are compatible with these transitions. Very quickly, I would like to begin by thanking all of our speakers. Thank you for being with us, or with us from a distance. So one finding, we're just trying to emerge from this crisis, and this has consolidated the consensus around sustainability. And this consensus very few of us will contradict this idea, so I'm just going to skim over this. We all agree to say that companies are committed to the ecological transition, the theme of short circuits, value chains, the need for greater resilience, the remote working and the digital transition, and also the flat organizations in company which build responsibility among people with a concern for the well-being of employees, with a meaning of work, and reinforcing the culture, corporate culture. So we are in a consensus that we need companies that are more responsible, that are not looking just at short-term profits. But I would like us to move a little bit away of this debate, which is a historical debate. If we had this meeting 1 year ago, we would already have been in agreement on the importance of these themes, because deep down, we understand that corporate models or even political models that are based on profits that are detrimental to society in long term, nobody wants it anymore, and the regulations will oblige companies to change. There is a question which is interesting, and that is, why has the crisis reinforced the desire for these sustainable models? That was not the outcome of the previous crisis. I think it would be interesting to have your reactions on this. I think that the health crisis is a real case study of externality, and it's reinforced the fact that we are able to coordinate ourselves to implement drastic change, which helps us to improve collective life faced with external shocks. There's also a question of a reality faced with a fiscal danger that the economic danger, the financial danger didn't, or the subprimes did not conjure up in people. As an economist, it's up to me to set the scene beyond the more aspirational theme. And what shocks me as an economist is this sort of people, are quite happy with the win-win discourse, so that we can find solutions to ecology which are win-win, which are good for stakeholders, for consumers, for employment, for health. And often there's a sort of a refusal to really arbitrate what needs to be arbitrated. And there are trade-offs, costs, benefits, and there are priorities to be chosen. I'll give you a few examples of this. The first, which is at the heart of our subject, is that of the digital technology. We know that digital technology, if we let it progress by itself on the labour market, it accentuates inequalities. Then the polarisation of the labour market with the disappearance of jobs that are at the heart of the distribution of salaries. On the one side, there are highly qualified jobs that benefit from digital, and others which are not complementary to digital technology. So we can't say to companies, automate everything, modernize everything, and also say you have to think about the question of employment and externalities and the effect of our economic choices on the market. Another example, very often the socially responsible investors have a marketing discourse on the theme, and they say it's good for your yields and it's good for society to invest in a socially responsible manner. But there are many cases. It's almost a logical statement where a company might be led to arbitrate not only between higher long-term profits and shorter shorter profits, and make choices that are good for society, but which means that there will be a decline in the value of the company in terms of the sums of future profits that it can yield. So that's an example where often we don't like having to arbitrate on these questions. And this is what I would like to ask you to do, is to really try and move out of this haze around the concept of sustainability, which is like a big suitcase in which we put a bit of everything, and which is a way of, so do we put the priority on employment as we come out of this crisis, or do we want our companies to modernize, to become more automated? Should relocated jobs be in old traditional smoking factories or in highly modern factories? So I'm going to stop there because we don't have a lot of time. I would really like our speakers to speak without any taboos and to talk about this notion of sustainable companies and their adaptation to the sustainable, but also don't hesitate to ask any questions that might disturb you, others. So beyond the well-thinking discourse, we really want to get into the heart of the debate. And we will hear the position of all of the speakers here who will be speaking frankly. So we're going to begin with Filippo Di Mora. You're going to be talking about these policies and also the limits, because there is a danger in implementing these policies. We're over to you.
I'm glad to be here. Unfortunately, I cannot be in Aix-en-Provence, particularly in the concert tonight, but next time. So let me make 3 points here, basically following up on what Augustin was just telling us. The first point is going to be emphasize productivity. The second point, capitalize from the experience of the global financial crisis. And the third, presumably, the need to avoid over-designing the employment landscape, a bit in the provocation of what Augustin was just telling us. Let me start with the productivity. I think it's great that we have a debate today on productivity, employment, and so on, because productivity is still not fully in the radar. Everybody is concerned, and rightly so, supporting employment, providing a blanket to business under stress. But still, productivity sooner or later must become sort of the most important thing we have to look at. So sooner or later we have to take hard choices in terms of the extent of this blanket that the institutional environment that the governments are putting on firms, because we know that sooner or later we have to really go back into market mechanism functioning as before, because we want to avoid the problem that we had, of course, previously of creating, of keeping alive undeserving firms. We want to have very soon a mechanism that can actually make sure that this crisis become really cleansing in the market, and so that there are exit but also entry of desert firms, so that we get back into this environment. So that's my first point. Go back into the productivity story and analyze what we can do to foster it as soon as possible. Second point is on the issue of what the lessons have been. We have to sort of draw from the global financial crisis. You mentioned before that I'm actually leading a very large competitiveness network. We're looking at millions of firms gathering information on, right now we have about 20 countries in Europe, so we cover almost all Europe. So we have a lot of information about how we performed also at the firm level, in the last decade. Well, the verdict is actually quite dreadful. We know already that sort of the economic growth was very shallow, very slow, but also what we know is that productivity actually was very low and keeping basically going to a standstill in the last few years. So what we have to do is make sure that this is not, of course, it doesn't go back again. Now we have an opportunity, and that's the third point here. COVID sort of will be an extra opportunity to revise and rebuild the current capital stock. So if the incentives are right, the capital stock of firms could actually increasingly include the environmental related innovation. And in a sense, again, basically getting on the point that Augustin was making, why this crisis is different from before? Well, this crisis is different from before because, we learn that, we can work at the distance. We know the value of ICT innovation. So therefore, it's a crisis that give us a hope that we can eventually prop up that productivity growth that was, very, very shallow before. So that's my response on that. The last point I want to make is on the employment, which is related to what I was mentioning before, is that, we have to be careful in overstressing or overthinking about the landscape that unemployment will be created, going forward. Why? Because we don't know. We don't know what is going to happen. We know that it's going to. We are going to have now in experience a very large technological shock. But like in the past, all technological shocks are actually, of course, destroying labor, but also creating labor. So I think my advice on this is, again, for start the conversation, is that do not think too much what is going to be the employment landscape. Think about what you do to actually have a good system that actually can internalize and increase productivity by using the opportunity of much more ICT innovation and so on. Thank you very much.
Merci. Thank you very much. Thank you for keeping good time. Thank you to all our panelists. We're going to move on to you, Benoit Grisoni. I'm sure that you want to rebound on what Augustin said because you have a look of a banker. And what do you think about what Augustin said? This is the right question to ask. The transitions, seeing from my point of view, I'm not an economist, but what I see is that transitions are carried by consumers, citizens, and what we see clearly is that through our behaviors, we see some contradictions, and there are different contradicting aspirations. For example, the research of services that are more and more efficient, permanent flexibility, spending power, things that I would link to the question of efficiency. And on the other hand, we have the future of the planet at heart. So we're pulled between different directions. No, how I see it from a digital pure player, because we're part of the transition, and we employ less people than most banks. We only have 800 employees for 2 million clients. It's less than a traditional bank. I don't think that efficiency can serve as a sole program. We have to be, of course, more and more efficient, and we have a lot of work to do in terms of innovation. We tested a few things, concrete measures, teleworking, talked about it earlier. If we roll it out for production teams, it will change the lifestyle of our employees, and it could create trigger effect. And to reconcile the second part of our brain, it will only come through clients. So it's going to depend on the offers that we come up with, that the processes that we develop, and that will meet the needs. Half of the new clients that join us are 32-year-old. That's the average age. So their mindset is to change things and to look for meaning. And they're looking for green investments. We have labels, of course, that are like the ISR label. The point is to help our client to benefit for commercial purposes. I'm going to be very pragmatic. People need it, and our role is to do that and to be very, very demanding and making sure that our offer comply to other criteria. There's some taxonomy. Concerns. It's good to have benchmarks, but you mean everybody has their own benchmarks. There's not something that is standardized. No, I'm going to be honest here. Is if we want to exclude some sectors from the economy because we don't like carbon. So, for example, do we stop investing with Total? But we try to find ways to align everybody's interest and to manage the transition. So the label has to be a label that we can count on. If we want to do ecological loans with Boursorama, and if we want to change the energy of your apartment, of your home, I'm going to give you a rate that suits you. So I have a lot of levers on the offer. I can create credit cards that are not physical credit cards anymore, which generates even less paper and production. So we have to come up with innovative solution, and if we're lucky enough to have a lot of clients, there'll be a lever effect. That's how I see where I can change things at my level. So these transitions will be rather positive in terms of productivity. I have to be as efficient as possible, which is the conditions of companies. I need to maintain the employment of my employees, and then I have my clients, and my clients can serve as a huge trigger level effect, and they will contribute through solidarity products, through savings products. Maybe one day we'll have to stop offering products that will not work anymore, like some investments. If tomorrow somebody tells me I want a life insurance only containing ISR products, why not? Today we have mandates that only contain ISR products. Could it replace completely the whole of the portfolio? I don't know. So could you be completely green? I know the Banque Postale does it. I know that they set themselves this goal. I like the concrete measures that we have implemented yet. I think we should offer for all solutions products that have a meaning and that meet the criteria that are consistent with the whole. There's an issue of accessibility to banking products. I could talk about it for hours. Thank you, Benoit. We'll get back to you for a Q&A session because we'll take the questions from the audience. So please feel free to send your questions if you have any. We're going to move on to Karim TADJEDDINE. You have your point of view as well. What is your opinion on the job market, which is completely shaken up at the moment? It has an impact on productivity. What do we have to do afterwards, and what does this crisis bring us in terms of ways of looking at things? Yes, this employment issue, I saw it through different angles, through the reaction of our clients and companies and the world of associations. And I want to go back to two things. First, the assessment of the situation. There's four crises, four changes that are happening at the same time. We have a special case of difficulty of adjustment between supply and offer. We know 50% of employers say they have a hard time finding employees, but at the same time, there's an unemployment rate among young people that is very high. People are not very mobile. Second mutation is technological evolution with the acceleration of the digital transformation. And this change is quite different from the previous ones. Because if you look at it closely, there's less than 10% of jobs that are fully automated. And that will be compensated by the creation of new jobs. But if you look at the new jobs, you see some activities and skills. If you look at a banking advisor, he welcomes clients, he takes actions. And if you look at these activities, there's 2/3 of the employees for which most of their activity is going to change. So this change that is coming is going to affect everyone like it has never been the case before. So we have to support the employees to help them ramp up their skills. You have to be flexible and capable to adjust. The third change, and we did address it in the notes that we released today on the climate change, we're very close to major climate changes. At the horizon of 2050, we see the effect of the climate change. We know that Marseille will probably in climate conditions that are very close to the ones that we have now in North Africa, for example. So it has going to have some consequences on agriculture, on tourism, on insurance, banking, transport. And today, that's where we need to anticipate the mutations linked to this climate change in the Mediterranean region. And on those three mutations comes the COVID crisis. So that means that a fourth of jobs in Europe have been impacted, reduced activity, unemployment. So if you look at it closely, the evolution of the COVID, it created, of course, forced teleworking for everyone. For a lot of Europeans, it was the first time that they started working from home. A lot of them were happy about it, so they found it satisfying, and a lot of them want to continue working from home. Then we could see that some sectors have been put on hold. And the third element is compared to the digital change that I mentioned earlier. In 3 months, there's been 5 or 6 months of normal transitions, changes. In 3 months, we had the same number of changes that we would have normally in 5 to 6 years. So that has an acceleration effect of the mutations that we talked about earlier. So facing that, what can we do? At the level of companies, we have to train people again to ramp up the skills of our employees, and it's our utmost priority. The amounts that are invested have no comparison to what was invested before, and it's done in a time frame of 1 to 2 years because everybody's conscious that the pace is only accelerating. The second change is the question of adjustment of our training programs. And the third one, I want to go back to what Augustin said about the combining short-term and long-term. We're looking at an historical period where we can reconcile the short-term goals for 2 to 3 years, which is to generate activity, investment, capex, to the need of a longer-term investment to address the energy, environmental transition issues. So if you look at the shipping, we have to maybe change that, the railway shipping, transport. So that's teleconsultation is another area that we should develop. And I'm going to go back to my 5 to 6 year time period. We're way beyond what we had anticipated. And on this green package, we feel that we could even go faster in the next 2 to 3 years and speed up the investments to meet our goals and for once to anticipate the next crisis.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on with Geoff. Geoff TILY, you are with us by video conference. We're here to listen to you. I think you have a lot to say. Just maybe you want to react to what has already been said by the different speakers.
Bon, on va vous laisser régler ce problème. Peut-être on reviendra vers Geoff TILY tout.
So we're going to let you solve the sound problem. We might come back to Geoff TILY later on. So we're going to move on with you, Jean-Jacques BARBERIS. So thank you very much. I'm going to, maybe we'll come back to the question raised by Augustin to begin with, when he said we're at a time when the ideological battle had been won and we all were in agreement that sustainability is the right pathway. I'm not sure that we're at that point where the ideological battle has been won, and maybe we are partially in France, maybe in Europe partially, but I'm not sure elsewhere in the world. And so, although we can hope that we've made progress recently, I don't think that it's time to give up on that front. And we must not disarm yet, I believe. I think that what Augustin underlined, which is reassuring, we saw in the major financial crisis that the environmental subject that was on the table was very quickly put off the table, and the Copenhagen failure was a an illustration. Here we can see that faced with a social and unprecedented social and economic crisis, that the ecological question is still on the table. I think it's maybe a little bit early to say that we've won the battle, so we have to be very cautious about that. So we're going to try and answer the question as to why we're at a time when we can consider that nevertheless the subject is still there on the table. First of all, there's a time question, a historical question. The Rio Convention 92 is practically one generation behind us now. And it's simply the result of historical maturation. As Karim said, there's also been some very strong crystallization effects on the subject due to the COVID crisis. And we hope that this will help us to keep the subject on the table. So the question is, if we consider that we can resolutely commit to the environmental transition, what impacts can we anticipate on employment? So I don't want to, of course, be too consensual, but we can see that there is a net positive effect, and at minimum, the effect on the employment will be stable. However, if we look at things in detail, this does disseminate sectoral changes that are major. And it's interesting to see that the Transition Fund is at the heart of the European Revival Programme at the moment, and it's a tool that intends to respond to this. So we mustn't lie to ourselves. To commit to transition will have extremely violent distributive and strong effects on employment, and we must prepare for this. And this leads us to questions of arbitration, which can be terrible questions. And my conviction is that the question of the social acceptability of the transition will become, I'm sorry, I'm going to maybe be unpolitically correct, but one of the main challenges of the social contract in the 21st century is the contract signed by the company with its employees. And I'm convinced that this is an essential challenge that is ahead of us, including in the way in which we evolve our business models and also the relationship we have with the employees. That's the case with the quest for meaning that the young generations are seeking. I think it goes beyond this. I think that fundamentally today, if I put on my hat as an investor, today, we're increasingly attentive, and we try to include in our investment decisions the way in which companies are committing to the transition. But what we will try to do increasingly in the future is to see how, thanks to their reaction, they participate in the social acceptability of the transition. A very simple example, if you're a big energy company, you close your coal production units because you know that's incompatible. What do you do with the employees? So what's the answer? How do you prepare for this? So how do you invest in human capital in the future to prepare for the social acceptability within the company? There are French examples. I'm not going to quote any French companies, but who have tried to lead these policies. So I think that we will be increasingly attentive to these. And this allows me to answer the last question that was raised by Augustin, which was, can we reconciliate? It could be a win-win situation. Can we have both financial payback and environmental payback? I think it's an extremely complex question. What I can say today, what we observe, is that at this given point, yes, it's a win-win situation, but for a reason which might not be a very pleasant reason, which is a practical reason. It's because there's demand. And so if the investors who are investors, who are for private individuals or large institutions, ask more and more to invest in companies that have an environmental performance that is better than others, it creates a demand effect, which has an impact on prices, quite simply. But today, we are able to demonstrate that for European companies today, those that have the best environmental and social performance, their shares are relatively more costly, and the cost of capital is less costly than others. That's good news, but it's a transitory effect, because when all of the market would have shifted, and we hope that it will, at that point the window will close. And but in the short term, we can recommend an investor to invest in companies that have a better social environmental profile, and despite your own personal preferences on the subject. I think that that's good news, because to come back to Karim's point, it can possibly participate in the short term to find solutions that will help us in the midterm without being overly optimistic, which would be very dangerous. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jean-Jacques Barberis. We finish with you, Thierry, and then Maybe we will come back to Geoff TILY afterwards. Okay, so first of all, we'll listen to Thierry. So Thierry, you can come back over what we've said, and you can tell us how today we can make these time horizons within the crisis context. How can we deal with all of this? Yes, I like the way in which Augustin introduced the debate, because it's opposed to Friedmanian consensus, as he said. Yes, I think he's absolutely right. There is a consensus in people's minds among the elite, the economists, the politicians. It's very good. But real life is very different. It's far more difficult. And Jean-Jacques is right. If we start to look all of this as if we've won the battle, we will lose it. So must I remind you that 2 years ago, the streets were full of people who were fighting against an increase in carbon taxes, which in terms of public policy were imperfect and maybe not sufficiently redistributive a response, but it was a response to the challenge of the climate change. So things are not that easy. They're even less easy when you're in an economic crisis. As we said it on in 2008, we made choices with regard to the financial emergency to the detriment of the ecological environmental emergency. And so we did not reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So the reaction of public economic policies in 2008 is not sufficiently green. Then comes the COVID crisis, and with an economic crisis of an extent that nobody had foreseen, of course. And no, we haven't seen the end of it. No. And here, something quite surprising happens. So the ecological policies are not pushed aside. Why? A number of factors were advanced in the discussion. Maybe the climate crisis is already part of the experience of many people and economic agents within the country. There is a lot of farming land that has been under water stress for a number of months. I would like to recall that in February it was 28 degrees centigrade in the Pyrenees and in the Var region. The tiger mosquito, which is a vector of disease, was present in 3 French departments 15 years ago, and now it is in 45 French departments. So the effects are there, and they're part of the experience of people, and that changes a lot. I think it's one of the factors that explains that ecological policies continue to be very present despite the economic crisis, which is a European factor, because I think that there is a concert of European reactions that converge on this point. But it remains difficult. And I think that when you look at the situation from a point of view of the allocation of public resources, it's a very tricky situation, which is a new tragedy. To come back to the economic theory terms, in order to deal with the economic emergency, you need to take a certain number of decisions with a very quick effect to save employment, including in highly carbon sectors. Automobile is not a decarbonated sector. And we've just proceeded with the bailout plans where the state has helped out. And in the aeronautical industry and in the automobile industry, there have been bonuses for the conversion, etc. So subsidies are there. And the economic emergency means that we have to go and save these companies that are not the most exemplary in this area. And if you do this, you might lag behind on other areas, such as the climate emergency. So we are in a medieval story here, where you have somebody who's dying from thirst and hunger, and there's a field of oats and a river, and the closer he gets to the oats, the further away he gets from the river, and vice versa. So how can we in this situation, bring together the condition of our life, oats and river, the economic emergency and the ecological emergency. And the ecological transition is not simple. It represents a cost because we must change carbon capital into decarbonated capital. We must change our car quite concretely for millions of people. If we can't move house, we have to renovate a house. All of this has a cost, and people will have to be helped to achieve this. So let us not lie to the general public. There is a cost to this. It's difficult, and solving this dilemma is complicated. And that is the task of the generation of political decision makers that are in power today. And the government said it. Le Maire said the revival will be decarbonated. Yes, the future is the time of profits. I'm not sure it's that of the Minister of Economy. He will have to tell us why first. I believe that we have to really underline policies that represent obvious co-benefits. The energetic renovation of buildings present co-benefits. There are benefits of a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which are quite obvious. But you also have important benefits of creation of economic activity, because there are so many workers and building companies that will be doing the renovation, and they'll have to upgrade things and learn how to do things that they don't know how to do yet in terms of productivity, professional content. It's extremely favorable. So let us engage in this direction. And also there are health benefits. We live better in houses where you don't die from heat in the summer, and households will make savings. They won't make savings immediately. Let's not lie to them there. First of all, there's cost and effort, and then you will reap the benefits. The world after is better, but the pathway you have to travel is not covered with roses. So the transformation of the existing fleet of vehicles also brings co-benefits. So there needs to be a collective effort, and this has to be distributed, because the twin risks that we face are: if we sacrifice the economic emergency to climate policy, which is not going to happen, we hope, but we will put the middle and lower class populations in a difficult situation. And they will be the first artisans of an anti-ecological reaction, because they will have too much to lose. That's also why the Civic Convention for the Climate made so much effort thinking about this public, creating alternatives, support, aid. It's not easy, but if we leave these people along the way, then we won't achieve anything. And the other risk, of course, is that of neglecting the climate transition and finding ourselves not in 50 years' time, but in just a few years' time, in 10 years, 15 years, faced with numerous climate disasters. So we have to speak concretely about this, because otherwise we can't understand it. The Sevenol storms, which are local here, that we've seen for the past 10 years, are disasters. The waves that have come inland on the western coast have caused considerable damage. I'll give many examples: the floods, the forest fires in southern Europe. We are facing geophysical factors of extreme intensity and danger, and we must bear this in mind constantly, because the economic costs of these phenomena in 10 or 15 years' time, what we're experiencing today, will be considered as minor with what we will have to face in a few years' time.
Thank you, Thierry. So we're going to now join Geoff TILY. Can you hear us now this time? Can we hear you now?
Hear you. Can you hear me?
Oui, c'est bon.
Yes, we're good. We hear you fine.
You can hear me fine. Okay, I'll start and we'll see what happens. So we don't think that the economics are so complicated as the previous speaker has indicated. We see that the starting point is bold action from the government, and we also see a risk of huge job losses and potentially the deepest recession since the 1930s. The OECD estimate that UK unemployment could hit 11% this year. So the UK Trades Union Congress is called a wage subsidy scheme, jobs guarantee, and for public investment. We argue that we need to rebuild public sector that have been pushed to breaking point by spending cuts. We're calling specifically for an extra £85 billion spent over the next 2 years on investment in technology and infrastructure to create thousands of jobs to prevent a recession. Today's session and all the speakers have exemplified the idea that the needs of the economy and the environment are presently aligned.
Ok, désolé Geoff, Geoff
But
TILY.
we think we want to have to confront austerity doctrine. And we need to more address
On va démarrer du coup la partie, on va dire, questions-réponses.
Sorry, Geoff, we can't really hear you properly, so I think we're going to start the Q&A session. We're sorry about that. There's a lot of questions that arrived on many points. moving into this transition? How can we improve the awareness? As Augustin told us, then have a lot of pedagogy to make things go forward. The questions that I received, there's one on employment and productivity. Could we start with a question on how to combine, this is for you, Thierry, a smaller working week and more resources for the energy transition, because this is really our topic of productivity, facing all these transitions. Could we imagine how it could work? The 28-hour working week is an idea that was discussed in the Citizen Convention for Climate. It was rejected at over 60% of the votes. But that led to a debate that I invite you to take a look at. It's a very good example of democratic debate between citizens. Why was it rejected? It was rejected by the youngest members of the convention, who said it's difficult enough as it is. Don't make it harder for us. The competitiveness of the economy is already very difficult. So we're getting into the job market, so think about us. And some of the arguments that were invoked, a lady who's a retired lady and concierge, and she said it's always good to share, but it's always the same who work less and some who don't work enough. I worked 50 hours a week with 2 kids, so I don't want that time sharing, work time sharing. So some people said that they needed time to commit, to help others, and sharing working time is a way to fight against unemployment. That was the other part of the arguments. So I don't want to give away the ideas of the convention, but I will tell you what I saw as a contradiction. The exact proposition was 20 hours work per week with the same income, which is the minimum income in France. And that's a contradiction in itself. If you believe in sobriety, in frugality, you have to accept to make less money, to work less and keep the same compensation does not work, economically speaking, and is not consistent. If we want to decrease, we have to accept to make less money. I'd like to hear you out on this theme. With our theme of employment and productivity, could it be a solution to work less? We have to combine frugality and efficiency, and the part of innovation is not the only answer to climate change. The pace of innovation does not allow us to solve everything with innovation. We need a part of innovation. We have a lot of editors who shared these thoughts and these reports, innovation with hydrogen, with hybrid, with renewable energies. Nobody said innovation is useless, but they did say that decarbonated technologies cannot be the answer to our problems, and we need new generations of technology. And they are calling for a huge technological disruption and new generation of new innovations. Does somebody want to say something else about degrowth? There could be some inertia effect that could be very strong. If you look at all the greenhouse emissions that decreased during the lockdown, we actually the idea is that we turned off the light, and by turning off the light, we should have reduced massively the greenhouse emissions, and it's not the case. because there's some inertia effect of the system. And to say it very simply in economic terms, you need to convert a stock of carbonated capital into a new capital that will be less carbonated and that'll emit less. But to get there, it requires investment and innovation. So let's not fool ourselves by thinking that innovation is going to address the whole of the problem. That's actually the American position up to the Paris Agreement. It's more complicated than that, but it's, of course, part of the answer, and it requires investment. Innovation, investment, do you agree, Karim? Yeah, also, I would say that we haven't gone to the extent of the logic of co-benefits. I think we should move forward on the themes of growth and energy transition. We talked about train transport, sorry. We should not give up moving up on both fronts at the same time. I'd like to add something as well. Why today we can't separate both issues. What we lived with the COVID crisis was a bit particular. We knew that there was the threat of the pandemics, but it was hard to imagine a clear scenario. And because it was difficult, nobody did it. And the environmental crisis is about the same. We know there's going to be more storms. We know all that, but it's out there. And the epidemiologist crisis helped us to anticipate what's going to happen more quickly. We have to combine both elements, address quickly all the needs of the sector. Jean-Marc, do you have anything to say? Jean-Jacques, sorry, reaction? No? So let's take another question, maybe for you, Jean-Jacques. So during his conference, Jean-Marc invokes the 2-degree strategy. What would be the solutions to develop a business plan in agreement with this strategy? Jean Covici, who's at the Council for the Climate, it's a very difficult question because the -4% is the number that we need to keep the goal. And that raises the question for the investor that I am that is difficult to address is how do we find companies that have defined a business model that is compatible with the climate goals? And today, there are some, aren't there? Yes. But today, it depends on the methodologies. But today, if you look at companies that are listed in the world, that are about 8,000 of them, those who had decided on some goals that are compatible with this -4 degrees objective, there are not that many of them. In order to create a portfolio that is aligned on these goals is very difficult because it could be bringing in some risks. So in the question that is being asked, there is a request to companies to take commitments and deliver on the goals that they set for themselves. And that would encourage investors to invest in those companies. In order for investors to invest in companies in a world that is compatible with -0.5 degrees, it has to be done in a dialogue where investors are pushing for it, companies to commit on that, and more companies will decide to go down that road. And this is the only way how it could be aligned, the world of investment and the world of companies, to go towards this trajectory. The numbers are striking. What are the other companies doing? No, some companies are not taking any commitments on the reductions of their greenhouse gas emissions. I don't want to give particular precise examples, but some companies don't do it for many reasons. Is it greenwashing? What is the reality? What is the marketing speech? On climate issues, we are more and more technically equipped, or better technically equipped, to measure the impact of the announcement of companies and what they do. Of course, we're lacking some details, some information, but we have more and more elements. Do you want to react, Karim, to what was said about these goals?
What we have seen on the company side of things is that, and I think that Jean-Jacques' point is important, we're talking about European companies. I think that today there is a consensus on the importance of the subject, and all of these questions around a transition have been translated into the corporate processes. And so when you make an investment, you have to look at the carbon impact. And I think that over the past 3 or 4 years, there's been a big step forwards taken with regard to these questions. And then there's a question of methodologies, so that we can measure the reality and ambition, because today it's very difficult to test what is greenwashing, what is reality, and the impact on the climate change. So in past 3 years, we've made as much progress as we have in several previous cycles. And we can see that on the customer side of things are speeding up due to the COVID as well. Yes, if players such as us, for example, it means that we must have means, and so there's savings made during this health crisis because they haven't been spending money, and this money could be used usefully, and everybody understands the interest to it. Yes, it's better for them to use it than to keep it. Yes, I think they should use it, because I think that our customers, who are rather young consumers, and who want to engage in something that has meaning. They want to engage in something that's meaning, but they also need performance. So it's rather ambivalent. And so, but for reasons that are maybe artificial today, it so happens that the performance is there today. Because if you chose an ecological investment, then and social responsibility investment, then you have a good payback. So, but we have to be very demanding on the quality of reporting and the references to be certain that the discriminating character between different actors is clear. So the other palette is to manage to educate people. There's a very important learning aspect to these questions, because it is a battle that requires different points of view. You mustn't forget that France, like any country, has very different points of view depending on what your standpoint is. So for us, for our customers' consumption, we are able to explain to them what their carbon footprint is. But the question is, on an average basket, and I'm lucky because I have a lot of data, and I would like to at least give my clients, for information purposes, a feedback on that data. Why don't you do it then? Well, we're looking at how to go about it. There are some startups that are working on this, but the problem is I have a big doubt as to the quality of the information. Because there's an organization that's trying to do that has made a lot of improvements, and who's tried to develop a sort of score on our consumption. But if you go to Carrefour supermarket, and I'm sorry for quoting them, but on an average basket, you don't have the detail of what's in the basket. But there are things that are starting to transpire which look quite hopeful. I'm sure our customers would like to know. We would want to know. We want to understand. And I could even imagine some incentives. So a lot is possible. And that's why innovation, I believe, is a major lever Maybe I'm too optimistic or maybe too practical, but I think that there are solutions to all of our problems. The question is that there must be sincerity behind all of this, of course, and it must all be coherent and we must be certain as to what we're doing. That's never easy because the interests at the end of the day, as we said earlier, and there are maybe 200 who are doing a good job and the others maybe not so well, but it's not, we shouldn't be throwing stones at them. So you're talking about supermarkets. Yes, we have apps where we can look at products and to see whether the product is good or not. And it's becoming enriched with more and more elements to see the origin of the products. Yes, it's easy for me to say, well, here you could make an effort. But, you know, nicely, of course. Then we have to go a lot faster. The figure given by Jean-Jacques is frightening. 200 companies. And we're at the very beginning of the slope. And it's not going fast enough. We have to speed up, all of you. And you have to have a voluntary approach. No, it's not a joke. There is one point that's very right, is that the references are not ready. They're not certain. And so we need to harmonize things. Yes, I'm very favorable to the mentioned policy, which aims for a virtuous approach, but the NGOs that use this must be able to hit in the right place, and that's not always easy. And so the CO2 results are imposed on our companies that already have a CSR reporting obligation. It seems to me that it's necessary to really set down appropriate reference and adapted references. We have to do it in the coming months, not in the coming years. Jean-Jacques' figures are really worrying. Jean-Jacques, you wanted to add something with regard to what Benoit said. Yes, I agree in the fact that we need common references, but we also have to be careful because the time of taxonomies is not necessarily that of action. So taxonomy can take a long time to develop, and so there has to be a balance to find. If we wait for too long, we have exactly the perfectly reference. And there's a good example of taxonomy. For example, there are certain rare animals that we waited for years to find where we had to classify it, the platypus. And so we need to have common references to do this. And so we can't wait for European taxonomy to be entirely equipped and ready to act. Otherwise, it will take too long. Yes, but if I can only really have a voluntary action if I'm confident in the references. I can be it in lots of areas, in the credit, in the investments, at my own small level, and I can do it because it's in my interest to do it, and I'm sure that it's the right way to go about things. But I need to be able to rely on something robust. Otherwise, either it will create bubbles and there will be financial issues that will rear up, and that can decredibilize everything we're doing. So one day we might realize we mustn't wait for it to fall out of the sky, but that is of course, the commercial vision. But Thierry, you're saying that it's what will encourage companies to go in that direction? Because we know that with the COVID crisis, the companies are faced with other concerns, maintaining the jobs, maintaining their orders. So can we, in addition, ask them to comply with environmental standards as fast as you're saying? Well, I'm not aware of of course, I'm aware of the costs and the difficulties. I'm not going to forget them in the space of half an hour. But the answer to your question was given to you by Benoit earlier on. It comes from the customers. The customers are demanding more guarantees, more fairness in terms of the climate, the environment, and social aspects. And this is a rising curve, and I think that it will rise sharply. And there are areas in which it will really create difficulties. There's one area that we haven't talked about. That's agriculture and food. Yes, I had a question for agriculture, so I'm going to ask it. We have a question from one of the audience. So just to show you that we're connected with you. How can we valorize jobs that are perceived to be of low added value, such as market gardeners and farmers, and the return to small-scale agriculture? Can this be part of the response? Well, the answer is very long. It's a very good question, a very fair question. The key of the debate on modern agriculture is soil health, because you are not going to mortgage out future crops. You're not satisfying your needs to the detriment of future generations, and therefore soil health means fewer inputs, declining productivities because your yields will be lower, and unless you increase prices. Yes, and that's the key, if you like. At the end of the day, the problem is that we've become accustomed to paying very little for very precious goods. Maybe not during the crisis, because we bought local food, so that no more tomatoes coming from Spain, and therefore we bought more costly produce. Maybe. But as a whole, the share of food consumption in the household's budget over the past 30 years has been reduced to very little, and this very little is not comparable to the essential nature of these goods and to the work of the people who produce them. So the question of your listener is talking about work, so more organic farming practices, or a farmer that's trying to change the model to preserve the health of the soil is maybe more productive and uses more labor because you're relying less on inputs. But it's a very technical agriculture. When we look at things closely, when you talk with farmers who've turned organic, with people who are making organic wines or biodynamic wines, it means that the farmers require skills and techniques that are very sophisticated. Yes, the farmers use a lot of digital technology, yes. Yes, so there's what we call precision agriculture. A few days ago, I was in the Drôme department in a village where there is the biggest company in France for the farming of insects that they spray over the fields to cope with pests and fungi. That is innovation also. That's the agroecological innovation. It's there. It's developing. It's being developed in France. So the agriculture of tomorrow is not a prehistoric agriculture. No, it's very technical. But it's knowledgeable with regard to the preservation of natural resources and our natural heritage that we will hand on to future generations, and they will rely on for their food. So we're drawing to the close of our debate, but to conclude, should we today not entirely rethink our production methods? Because you said maybe we have to accept to pay more, to pay for market gardeners or people who come and work. We saw during the COVID crisis that there was all of these second-line people, not the carers, but people who look after waste, and people working in supermarkets who were paid very low wages. And we're talking about relocating. We can relocate, but we will have to pay more for cars if we relocate their production, for example. So this theme, productivity, to improve it in order to be aligned with the ecological transition, shouldn't we have to rethink the economic model? Yes, that's what we were saying. We need a lot of support if you want low-income classes to eat organic food in the future, then of course it's more costly, and the positive externality is that people will be in better health, but we have to help them. So the Civic Convention proposed that there be food coupons. That's a rather a stigmata, but maybe there's a whole part of the society that doesn't have access to that today. So it is a very difficult subject, but there are some initial responses we can bring of this type. Well, taxes can also be positive and can help to encourage people to purchase certain things to compensate from the gap in the price. So to come back to the theme of the roundtable to employment, because what we're saying, and you're giving the example of the farmer, is just how far the content of our professions will be changing in the coming century. And the question is how we help people who are working and how we prepare them for this future. And so that we can help to achieve this transition in the 10 coming years. Yes, I think that the crisis that we're experiencing now, and which is still ahead of us, makes us to realize that the question of ecology mustn't be pushed aside because the fight hasn't been won yet. And secondly, because there is a social and economic crisis that is extremely intense, how can this help the social acceptability of the transition? And that is really the heart of the topic that we're faced with. And that will be raised and will be an element of very strong tension in most liberal democracies. So, Mr. Filippo, I'm sorry we haven't talked to you very much. I hope you're still there. Would you like to give us your conclusion, Mr. MAURO?
Debate. One thing I wanted to say is 2 points quickly on Thierry and TADJEDDINE. On Thierry, I think that I want to emphasize, I was mentioning before, that for me it's very important that we have productivity in front of us as a main criteria. Market efficiency is urgent that we reconstitute this, and this, I think Thierry said this clearly. I think an additional point is that with respect to the global financial crisis, this becomes even more urgent, as Thierry was saying, because we have additional criteria that we have to add, so environmental conservation. So I think that it's important that we insist, that the continuation of the support of governments to firms should be actually conditional to additional criteria to the potential for growth. For instance, we can add their environmental efforts. So I think that's a point that fairly complement what Thierry was saying. On TADJEDDINE, I think that it is important to underline what he was saying, the fact that we have a very low mobility of labor. This is something that, in fact, our research shows. This, we have to work on it. I mean, there is too little entry and too little exit, so the markets of labor market are still very static. And this is not acceptable in a situation where, and was not mentioned so far, that we have not only machines replacing man, but we have actually artificial intelligence replacing man. So not only men which are low-skilled labor, but also, physicians and so on and so forth. So I think that there is an urgency also there, as TADJEDDINE was saying, on retraining and make sure that we are responding to the incredibly quick changing needs of the labor market. Thank you very much, anyway, for having me in this panel. Very interesting panel.
Thank you, Filippo. So a word of conclusion, maybe very quickly. Yes, very quickly. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to our listeners for having played the game and having joined in the debate. It facilitated the debate and made it very exciting. If I were an artificial intelligence or an algorithm that analyzes the debate, there are 3 words that kept coming back on the table: innovation, support, and emergency. They're the 3 words of the common denominator that keep coming back on the table, with this idea that the climate deregulation is becoming tangible and people are starting to actually see it, and therefore the battle is just at its beginnings, and we've not won the fight yet. I would say that there's sort of implicit underlying aspect between adaptation and avoidance. So for a long time, this debate on the transition were debates on how can we achieve this 2-degree trajectory. We'll see, and I think we'll see this in following sessions and next year in X, that we are also shifting to a question of very concrete adaptation. So I am a farmer in this department in France, and I have this problem. How can we adapt to the new situation? So there will also be an antagonism between these 2 things. And we have to realize that there are 2 subjects: invest to avoid and mitigate the disaster at the global scale, and how to invest to locally make sure that people have the means to adapt to the new climate conditions as best as possible. In any case, thank you very much. It was very clear. And I would like to thank you for each of your interventions. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.